Hello, I'm going to make another video about sudo. In my previous video, I showed you how to install sudo on a Debian Linux system, how to add a user to be able to use sudo, and what are the advantages of using sudo. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about restriction we can configure for sudo. In a basic Debian configuration, after the installation, exactly as I showed you on my previous video, when you want a user to be able to use sudo, you just have to add them to a group, the sudo group. And after that, he will be able to execute all commands with administrator rights when you add sudo before the command. Now, I will show you how to configure restriction for a user or a group of users. For example, in your company, if you have people who administer your database and they sometimes need to perform maintenance with administrator rights, but they don't necessarily need access to all commands with administrator right. So it's possible to configure it so that this user can only use a few commands. I will show you how to do that. I'm going to show this on the Debian 12 system. I'm currently connected via SSH to that system, and I have two users. The first one is user 1, and he already has sudo rights and can execute all commands with sudo, exactly as I configured it in the previous video. The second one is Bob, who is currently a standard user without administrator right. We're going to add him access to sudo, but only for certain commands. How do we do this? We must edit the Sudoers config file. Of course, we must do that with administrator rights. So do it with the user who currently has the right to use sudo or log in as root. In my case, I will use sudo and the vi sudo commands to edit the Sudoers file. I recommend using vi sudo because after modification, once you save the file, it will check the syntax of your configuration file. If you made a mistake or there's an invalid instruction, it will notify you and it will ask you what you want to do. For example, it will give you the option to edit the file again, to correct the mistake, or to exit the file without saving. Firstly, I will open the config file. For this video, we will only focus on the user privilege or the group privilege and this basic configuration we saw in my previous video. When we add a user to the sudo group, they can use sudo with all commands. It is this line that allows this. In this configuration file, when you specify a group, we have to use a %sign as prefix followed by the name of the group. In this case, it is sudo. And then we can add sudo parameters to this group. The first parameters is which hostname can use this instruction. For this video, we will leave it as all, but here we could specify host that can use that sudo instruction and when it can be useful to do that. Personally, I never use this setting, but I read that it will be useful, for example, in case where several systems share the same sudo config file. So the IT administrator have configured a single Sudoers file, config file, and they push it to all machines on the network. So inside they can specify which host this user or group can execute this command with sudo. I didn't test it, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you use that host instruction and sudo parameter. Here we can specify which user we can pretend to be when we're using sudo. I thought that sudo means super user do, but sudo can not only be used to execute a command with administrator right, we can also execute that command as another user. For example, if I use sudo -u, the username, and follow it by a command, it will execute that command as that user. So by specifying al here with the sudo command, you can transform you into any other user. Whereas if I specify a user, it will be only possible to execute that command as this user. For example, if on this system I have an Oracle database or another Oracle product like WebLogic, there are some tasks I need to do as the Oracle user. So I could specify here Oracle. So user on this group will only be able to run commands as Oracle. They will not be able to use sudo to execute a command as root. And here it's the same principle for group, and I will leave that as all too. The instruction I want to show you in this video is to specify which command I want my user to be able to use. In this case, it's currently set to all. So the user in the sudo group can use all commands. So I'm not going to modify this line because if I do, then all user in the sudo groups will be restricted to the command I will specify here. Instead, I will create a new group on my Linux machine, on my Debian server, and then add a similar line as this, but replacing sudo with the new group name. And at the end, I will specify the command that members of this group will be able to use. But in my case, I'm going to do this with a user and not with a group. So as I said earlier, I'm going to configure new sudo instruction for Bob. I'm going to copy this line, but here I'm going to specify the command I want Bob to be able to use. One more thing I want to specify is here you have to provide the command's full path. For example, if I want Bob to be able to use apt to manage package on my Debian system, I cannot just write apt. I have to write the full command path. If you don't know the full path for a command, you can use the where is command followed by the command name. In my case for apt, the path is /usr/bin/apt. So I'm going to paste it here. So if I leave it like that and I save the file, Bob will only be able to use sudo apt command. For example, sudo apt update, sudo apt upgrade to update the Debian Linux system. He will also be able to use sudo apt install followed by a package name to install it, but it won't be able to use sudo vi/etc/fstab or sudo pvs to display the physical LVM volume of this system. You can specify several commands separated by a comma. For example, if I want Bob to also have access to the fdisk command, I will follow the same process. I will find the full path for this command and add it here. So now Bob can use apt and fdisk. I will save my config file. By default on a Debian machine, when we use vi sudo, it uses nano as text editor. If you prefer vi, it's possible to configure it to use vi. So with the nano text editor, to save a file, you have to press Ctrl O and you have to press Ctrl X to exit it. As I said earlier, vi sudo check the config file, the syntax. In my case, nothing is shown, which means there was no syntax error. So the change has been applied. And let's do the test. We will switch to my Bob session. I'm connected as Bob here, and we will test it. I'm going to try sudo apt update. It asked me for the Bob's password, and it worked. The update command updates the information of the repositories configured on my Debian Linux system. After, I could do a sudo apt upgrade to install the invaluable update. Bob has authorization to do this. And I can also use sudo fdisk to display the hard drive configuration. So it also works, but if I try, for example, to do sudo vi/etc/fstab, oh, that tells me that Bob doesn't have permission to execute vi. So if you don't know the full path of a program, of course I showed you earlier how to use where is command followed by the name of the program. But it's also possible to try a command with sudo. And like here, it will show you which command is unable to execute. And you will see the full path for this command. Let's go back to the config file. And other things, it is possible to add more stuff to the line, to add more commands and options. For example, if you want the user to only be able to do apt update, because if I only specify apt, we can use apt with all its options, like upgrade, install, uninstall. But in my config, if I specify an option, for example, in this case, update, then my user, Bob, will only be able to do apt update. So let's test it together. I will save the file. I will change the tab to go to my Bob's session. I will try to do sudo apt upgrade. It should say me that it cannot use this command. Yes, and it is exactly what the error says. But if I do apt update again, it should work, and it still works. So I come back to my user1 session, and I go back to visudo, because I have other things to show you. Like I said earlier, if you want to specify several commands, it is possible to separate them with a comma, but it's also possible to do several lines. For example, I could have write it like this and make one line by instruction. So now Bob has 2 lines for his sudo config. You can put as many lines as you want to specify the commands he needs to use. But I read in the documentation, if 2 instructions contradict each other, it's the one lowest in the config file which will have priority and be used. So this is how we can restrict access to sudo. As I said earlier, if you work with group, let's say I have a DBA group and I want them to be able to do apt update. Here the config, all the members of the DBA group will be able to use this command. Just for your information, I used visudo to edit the Sudoers config file. But the file, this config file on your system is actually in the /etc directory. And the file is called Sudoers. Of course, you need administrator rights to read it. And we see it's the same config file that I modified earlier. Something relevant to do? There is the directory which is /etc/sudoers.d. And in this folder, if there are config file with instruction for sudoers, it will take them as sudoers instruction for your system. It can be relevant to put your config about sudo in this directory. If an upgrade or an update deletes your sudoers file, modify your sudoers file, the modification you made in this directory should not be modified. And you can also use visudo to modify a file in this directory. So here is the instruction, for example, visudo-f and the path of the file you want to edit. So for your config file, put the name you want. It does not have any importance for the name. Of course, it can be useful to use a meaningful name. In my case, I will call it custom. It will be for my custom rules for sudoer. I will put them in these files. Of course, that things must be done with the administrator rights. In this case, it created the file because it did not exist. So that's it. I create the file and in it, I could put my instructions that I want exactly like I did earlier, just like that. For example, let's say I have a second user named Bob2. I could put this instruction, save it with Ctrl O because I'm with Nano, Ctrl X to close Nano. And because I use visudo to edit that file, it checked for the syntax error when I save and close it. So if I enter incorrect instruction in this file, it will tell me that, exactly like it did before. And it will tell me what is the syntax error and what I want to do. I'm going to press A this time to edit, and I'm going to make corrections. And if I save it again and close it. We are in business, no more error. And also, if you want to know what your user has the right to execute with sudo, there is a command to show that. So it is sudo-l uppercase U followed by the name of the user. So in my case, it is Bob. And at the end of the result, we see that my user can use the following command on my system name debian-vm. The different sudo instructions are listed for my user. If I do the same command to show my user1 instruction, okay, this is because my user Bob has limited access to sudo and cannot see another user's instruction. But now I will do the same thing with my user1 session. In the case of user1, who is in the sudo group, which is the default group on Debian when we install sudo, it can execute with administrator right all the commands existing in my Debian machine. We saw earlier that we can add several commands to a user. This is what brings me to talk about alias. We see here we can set alias. For example, a command's alias. This is like a group of commands, and we specify all the commands that we want to put in this alias. I will copy and paste here an example that I made to configure a command alias. The line must begin like this. And we can then specify the name of the command alias. I will call it software update. It is a command alias that I want to assign to some people that I want them to be able to do update in my system and restart it. So put the name that you want for your command alias. And like earlier here, we specify the commands. In this example, I will give access to apt update and apt upgrade. I add the reboot command too. So it's just an example. I invite you to adjust it according to your needs. And here, if I come back to my Bob sudo setting, I will put the alias. So Bob has access with sudo to do all the commands specified in this command alias. Before testing it, we're going to talk about the other alias that we can create and configure. We have host alias. This is what I talking to you about earlier, about the host. After that, we have user alias. It is if you don't want to use the groups configured in your Linux system, but you want to configure some kinds of group just for your Sudoer files. This is where it can be done. I'm going to copy and paste an example. So instead of the cmnd underscore alias, it is user underscore alias to specify a user alias. Like before, we specified the name of the alias, and I'm going to call it junior. It is for my junior system administrator. I don't want to give them too many commands. I just want them to do update on my system. In this user alias, we have Bob and Robin. And here, instead of specifying Bob, I'm going to specify the user alias, so junior, in capital letters, because I wrote it in capital letters here. In Linux, everything is case sensitive. So normally, in this configuration, Bob and Robin will only be able to use these 3 commands with sudo. I will save the file and exit the file, and we will test it. I go to my other terminal tab session, currently connected with Bob, and we will test sudo apt update. We will see if it still works. And yes, it still works. I will try to, for example, sudo apt install. Normally it should not work, and sorry, the user Bob is not authorized to execute this command. So I'm going to try upgrade. It will be better if I remove the install option. Yes, it worked. It asks me to confirm to apply the update. Since it's just an example, I'm going to enter no. It was just to show you if I have the right to execute that command with sudo. If I did not have the right, it will have shown me, like earlier, that Bob is not authorized to use the apt upgrade command. To reboot, I will try to use the sudo shutdown command, and it should not work. I cannot use that command. But if I do sudo reboot, it worked. My system restart. I just got disconnected from the SSH connection. And if I go to my virtual machine console, we see that it is restarting. Some security things to pay attention is which command you give access to your user. So if my user Bob needs to edit a file and use, for example, the nano command, so if I write it like that, it can be a security hole because now Bob will have the right to edit all the command file and system script file. If he edits a script to put instruction to give him more access, more right, and that script run automatically at the startup of the machine or by the root cron tab, so the user Bob will have full access after the script execution. It is the same principle if you give access to only the add user command. Maybe he will be able to create another user, assign that user to the sudo group, and voila, he will have a user with full administrator right. So that's it for this video. I hope it was useful for you. I wish you a good day. Bye bye.